this is going to be cool. I'm here with my greatest mentor, Gary Habermas. Honestly, I don't think I'd be a Christian today if not for Gary. When I was having some real doubts about my faith back in, was it probably 1988, the Baltimore call?
Yeah, we call it the Baltimore call. Yeah.
I was having some real doubts about my faith. I was finished my coursework for my master's degree, but back living in Baltimore, I was married at the time. I'd just gotten married about a year earlier, and I was having some real doubts about my faith. And back then, there wasn't email, Facebook, anything like that. 1988. So I called Gary Habermas, and he really helped me work through my doubts. And like I said, I don't think I'd be a Christian today if not for this man right here. So I love him. And anyway, Gary and his wife Eileen come and spend several days with us around Labor Day every year. Labor Day here in the U.S. is the first weekend in September. And last year would have been our 25th year in a row. But due to COVID, they weren't able to come. And then, so we planned on this year being number 25. But then Eileen got COVID. She was vaccinated with both shots, just like you were, right? But she still got it, but it was a minor case. Lord was good with that. And so they just delayed a little bit, and here they are. They arrived last Friday, and they're leaving tomorrow. So they'll have spent nearly a week with us, and it's just been great. But I figured while Gary is here, it'd just be great to have him to make him available to you all. So I've asked him to speak on near-death experiences and resurrection. We're going to cover near-death experiences first, and then we'll show how that can lead into the resurrection of Jesus. But Gary, what exactly is a near-death experience?
Well, there are a number of categories of near-death phenomena. And a near-death experience is before you die, something happens. Here's how it's often defined. A near-death state is a serious state from which you are most likely going to die if you don't get some immediate attention. And but people are resuscitated from near-death states. Sometimes they reach a point of what's called a death state, but they're brought back from it. So the whole thing is called a near-death experience.
Great. And how long you've been studying these? A long time, huh?
Yeah, probably about 10 years shorter than resurrection. So back to the 70s, 1970s. Yep.
So close to 50 years.
Am I that old?
Oh, you're old.
Yeah. I told him yesterday, someone was going to say, yeah, if you've been studying that long, you've probably been studying the resurrection since you've been 5 years old. That's probably about it. Both subjects are lifelong pursuits, and I think for good reasons. I think they dovetail with each other. I think they support one another.
Now, you're like an editor. You're an editor for one of the near-death experience journals, right?
I'm one of the reviewers.
Okay.
For potential journal articles, entries. Sometimes I've been called the Christian reviewer. Not that there's no other Christians that are reviewers, but as far as trained in relevant fields, that would allow me to read, those kind of subjects that are being submitted to the journal for articles.
Wow. So there are lots of reports of near-death experiences, right?
Millions. One medical estimate in a book of medical NDE articles collected from journals, peer-reviewed medical journal, estimates 9 to 20 million NDEs in North America alone. 9 to 20 million.
And now, not all of them are of the same evidential value, though, right?
No, very few more evidential value. I'd say of the millions and millions, I've collected about 300 evidential cases, and some of those are just barely evidential. The really good evidential ones might amount to about 100. And they're very valuable because they span different categories. In an article, a secular research article on NDEs years ago, I differentiated 5 different categories of evidence. Evidence from in the room where the person is located, evidence outside the room. It could be anywhere from down the hall in a hospital to a mile away at their house, or NDEs in the blind. And then two kinds of what I would call Twilight Zone type NDEs. One is where a living, healthy person gets caught up in the NDE of the near-death person, and sometimes they believe they went down a tunnel. They know when the person died or almost died, but they saw the same sort of things that the NDE saw. And the last one is the weirdest one, and that's where, let's say in an NDE, I'll just make something up. In an NDE, you meet a loved one who's been dead for anywhere from 1 week to 10 years, let's say, and that person gives you verifiable information that nobody on earth, as far as nobody knows, but they say something that's relevant to your brief conversation, and they tell you something like, hate to tell you this, but your favorite cousin it was just killed in Afghanistan, and you're going to get a telegram in 2 days. And 2 days later, you get the telegram. Things like that. But the person person receiving the report is near death. The person that supposedly gave the report is very much post-death.
Interesting. Hey, as we're going along with this, I see that some of you you have comments and some have questions. Like I see a guy named Michael, not me, but Michael, he says, "Hey, Mike, I'd love for Gary to clarify the crucifixion of Jesus in the Bible because I am Muslim." Michael, please, Gary will answer that. Be happy to answer that. But before you all ask questions, hold those questions. This is my first time doing this live, first or second time, and I'm going to interview Gary, ask him a few questions, and then I'll open it up for questions. Be happy to entertain your questions, but I won't be able to keep track of them because the comments keep pushing up. And hey, Lucas Hondros, you said, "I like the jersey, Dr. Licona." Well, this is an Atlanta Braves baseball jersey. I'm thankful to a fairly new friend of mine named Greg McMichael, who used to pitch for the Atlanta Braves, pitched in the 1995 and 96 World Series. And so we became friends. In fact, he and I did 3 fly on the wall videos. You can check those out on our YouTube channel. Just click the playlist and then look for Fly on the Wall, and then look for his. It's Greg McMichael. And it's cool. We talk about his baseball career and what it was like to be a Christian while in the major leagues and what it's like afterward and all this kind of stuff. It really gives you an insider's view on what it's like to be a professional baseball player. Anyway, I asked him at one point, could he get me a jersey, the same one that he would wear, that he would wear on the field. So an authentic jersey. And so, yeah, he got me this. And so Greg McMichael is my favorite baseball player of all time, and his name is on the back. And so that's what this is about. Go Braves. They're in the National League Championship Series. As of the time we're making this video, they're up 2-1 against a really, really tough Dodgers team. And I don't know what's going to happen, but man, all 3 games have been like really, really close. So we've been watching them. Gary and I have been watching them every night. It's been a really good series so far. Anyway, we will be answering your questions. So just hold them for right now. It says buffering. Okay. All right, folks. Must be a weak signal. Let me see what I can do. Gary, I'm going to let you talk for a little bit about near-death experiences, and let me see what I can do to strengthen the signal, okay?
Okay.
All right. Go for it.
Well, folks, the things that have got me interested in near-death experiences are the potential evidences for these events. And in the old days, 20 years ago, people would say, well, these people are near death, right? Yep. So their brains and or hearts are still operating, right? Yep. Then how can there be any evidence for an afterlife when they're not in an afterlife state? And a lot of things can be said about that. But earlier I gave 5 categories of NDE evidence, and inside a room, outside the room, and so on. And the interesting thing about this is that many, dozens now, dozens of NDE experiences are basically flat brain, flat heart, as far as we know, as far as is measurable from the data. If you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, your heart stops. And in experiments, the brain stops about 15 to a maximum of 30 seconds after the heart attack. So if a person has a near-death experience and they're reporting data that are verifiable, but they're on the floor or in a hospital room or on the surgeon's table, and they report this from 3 minutes after the known time, according to the machines, it's known when they passed out. And if they're reporting something verifiable 3 minutes after measurable stoppage of heart and after the 15 to 30 second mark of brain stoppage, they're in a highly evident state for a little while there, minutes at a time. And some people say that's a death state, that the near-death state surrounds that short death state from which it becomes a near-death state, and they're brought back by resuscitation or whatever. So some of these are very highly evidential, and there's hundreds of the best. I would say there are probably 100 really heavy evidence. And the point for me, the benefit here, is that NDEs evidence an afterlife. At least I think evidence the beginning of an afterlife, at least, is highly probable. And in a world where there's an afterlife, the key is that that's another world. The person looks down at their body and they're screaming at the doctors, "Don't beat on my chest. I want to stay here. Don't try to bring me back. I'm happy." But they're already in a different dimension, or if you will, a different world, because nobody down below can hear them. They'll say, "Leave me alone." And no husband or wife tells the doctor to pound in their chest or something. They're in another world. And that's the exact world in which the resurrection of Jesus happened. So I would say that in a world where there's an afterlife, it becomes quite probable that the afterlife involves what Christians call the resurrection of Jesus. So that's a value of NDEs, to show there's an afterlife and to show as a lead-in or a lead-out of resurrection. For those who think there's only one world, that's a scientific, naturalistic world. My question is, I'll say, time out. Have you heard of near-death experiences? To talk about another world. And the more you pile the evidence up, the more they're not going to be able to say, quote unquote, those things don't happen. Resurrections don't happen. Miracles don't happen. There is not another world. So the more evidence we have for near-death experiences, evidence a basically spiritual of some sort, spiritual worldview, as opposed to strictly a natural only worldview. So from different angles, that's the best, for me, the best take on near-death experiences and how they facilitate, help evidence, lead to belief in resurrection and another world.
Well, thanks, Doc. All right, I just hooked it up to Wi-Fi, so hopefully that helps. Yeah, I see John Diaz. Like the jersey, Dr. Mike. Well, I hope you all caught how I got this jersey. I know it was buffering for a little bit. If you didn't, it's because my friend Greg McMichael, who used to pitch for the Braves back in 95, 96 World Series, he got it for me. It's an authentic one, the exact ones that they would wear on the field. So I'm in the Atlanta metro area. Go Braves. And I see that one of you, let's see, Angel WVM. Oh, sorry, I got to say go Dodgers. Hey, Dodgers have a great ball club, and it's going to be hard for the Braves to beat the Dodgers. It's a good series so far. Wow, it really is. So anyway, I don't know what the signal is like right now. I'm going to do a speed test. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is working a little better right now. And I'm sorry for the hang-ups here. So, Gary, I don't know exactly what you covered, but are you aware of the? Oh yeah, it looks like it's working now. Good. Are you aware of the near-death experience by Don Piper, not to be confused with John Piper, but Don Piper with that book, 90 Minutes in Heaven?
I am read the book.
That's an interesting book.
It is. It's not an evidential NDE, but
No.
it's a very interesting one of those good testimony type NDEs.
Yeah, he was this pastor. He was coming back from speaking at a conference. It was a rainy day. He was going across this bridge in North Houston, and an 18-wheeler was coming across, and one thing led to another, and it was an accident, and his car got crushed, and he died. He was declared dead. He was dead for 90 minutes, and during that time, he said he spent some time in heaven, and he takes a chapter or two to describe, what he saw and heard and felt. It's pretty cool. And then the rest of it is like his recovery, and it was instructive to me as a Christian, because he was in such excruciating pain from the recovery. And I mean, he had this Russian contraption on his leg because he'd lost, I think it was an inch or two of his femur bone. They never found it. And so it was pulling that bone together and helping it to grow. And I think this was 1989. And so many times he wishes they just cut off his leg and amputated the leg and let him go from there, because it was just excruciating. He wanted to die, and he's thinking, God, why did you bring me back? Why didn't you just allow me to stay in heaven? And he came to realize, I'm not going to give away the whole story, but he came to realize that it wasn't for him that he brought it back, that God brought him back. It was for others. It's like God tapped him on the shoulder and said, I'm going to bring you back, but it's not for your benefit. It's for the benefit of my kingdom, for the benefit of helping others. And that's, I've really reflected on that over the years. It's like, we say God works all things together for our good to those who are called according to his purpose. And his purpose is that not necessarily our happiness, it's our holiness. And so these things happen to make us more like Jesus. But God is more concerned with our holiness. He's more concerned with his kingdom and what we can do to benefit his kingdom than he is with our own personal happiness and comfort. And that book was something that just was a slap in my face that said, Mike, it's time to grow up and step up to the next level in your growth as a Christian. So yeah, I thought that was pretty neat. And the thing about Don Piper too, I have a friend named Gary Hamrick, and he used to work at Don Piper's church. And back in July of 2013, my mom was in hospice, and she could die any day. And she did die on, I think, July 6th. And it was the 4th or the 3rd of July. I think it was the 3rd of July. I thought, wow, I'd read the book 90 Minutes in Heaven to my mom, and she loved it. I mean, you can imagine, reading about heaven to someone who's going to die any day. They're in inpatient hospice. And I thought, how cool would that be if Don Piper would speak with her? And it's like, I tried to contact through the website, and he was on the road at that time about 250 days a year. And I thought, man, I'm not going to be. Well, I had an inside track with Gary, not by me, but by Gary Hamrick. And so I called Gary and I said, do you still have contact with Don Piper? He said, yeah. I said, Gary, mean the world to me if you could do me a favor. And, but half hour later, Don Piper's calling me on the phone. He says, Gary told me about you and your mom. What can I do for you? And I said, would you talk to her? So that night at 6:30, my mom hadn't, I think this was on a Wednesday night, and they because of the pain and nausea, they'd given her medication, and she was asleep constantly, and they figured she'd be asleep the rest of her life. But she was asleep to avoid the pain and nausea since Tuesday morning. And so I woke her up and I said, hey, Mom, remember Don Piper? And she said, yeah. He's calling you in 5 minutes. And her whole face just lit up and her eyes got real big. And he called her and he spoke to her for 11 minutes. And basically he said this. My mom's name was Joy. And he said, Joy, Mike tells me you read my book and you were encouraged by it. And he says, look, heaven is an amazing place. The sounds is like nothing you've ever heard. The music, the colors you've never seen, and the joy and love that you experience while there. It's just amazing. And he said, look, my guess is that you think you're going to miss your family, and so you don't want to go, but you're not, because there's no time in heaven. And it's as though when you're there, it's like if you look behind you, your family would be right behind you. And he said, look, I love my family, Joy, but if God would allow me to, I would switch places with you in a minute. So he said, so look, you have nothing to fear. You have everything to look forward to. And Joy, I will see you at the gates. And she mustered up all the energy she could, and she said, thank you. And those were the last words she had. We left the room, and shortly after, she went to sleep, never woke up again. And that was just really cool. You know, the near-death experiences can provide comfort to many. So let me ask you this. There are near-death experiences in which non-believers, non-Christians, seem to have heavenly experiences. Explain that. How can that happen? If we take the Christian theology, it seems to me, as a New Testament historian, that Jesus actually made claims to be the only way. Not only do we have him saying such, like in John chapter 14, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. We have something very similar in Matthew, 11:27, when he says, that's called the Johannine thunderbolt. It's also in Luke. It says, no one knows the Father except the Son, and to whomever the Son wills to reveal him. And then you've got Paul all over the place, and other New Testament writers, all of whom, when they comment on it, they talk about Jesus being the only way, that there's no salvation apart from Christ. So when I see this being attributed to Christ in multiple independent sources, such as John and Matthew, Luke, which would be the Q source, when I see it's in peppered throughout the New Testament literature, it seems like where it's commented on, it's unanimous that they think Jesus is the only way. It seems to me the best explanation, although we can't be certain, the best explanation is that Jesus actually made such claims to be the only way. And if he rose from the dead, his claims are probably true. So the challenge I have is, if you've got these near-death experiences in which non-Christians are experiencing heaven, how do you reconcile that with Jesus' teaching, or the teaching of the New Testament, that he's the only way?
Yeah, I don't have a big problem with it. And the issue is this. When I study NDEs, I concentrate on the evidential cases. In fact, 2 people in the last week or so wrote and said, hey, I had an NDE. Do you want me to map out my experience for you? And I said, well, let me be honest with you. I'll read anything you send me. But I really only collect evidential cases, of which I have a lot of them. There's many more in print. And I said, they're the kinds I look for. Now, if you think about dynamics here, evidential cases would be, well, here's a couple of cases. Here's an in-the-room case. The woman has surgery. She goes to her hospital room. The doctor comes and talks to her, and he said, well, we checked for that. That's not the case. And you're fine on the machines. And she says, well, you didn't check for it. He said, well, don't tell me that. I know the machine was in the room. It was there with us. She said, yeah, but it wasn't. It was unplugged. He said, what do you mean it's unplugged? She said, the machine that you're talking about that give me the information I need is unplugged. It was unplugged. How do you know that? I saw it up above my body. I'm scanning the room, and I say, wow, what's that? There's a machine over there. It's not plugged in. So he left, and he went down the hallway and checked the room, and sure enough, the machine wasn't plugged in. Now, that's in-room verification, because she was out during that time. And then there's down the street verification. There's NDEs in the blind, but they see things out in the street, a car accident, something else. That could be datable. They know when she was out, and they know when the accident occurred, and things like that. But evidential cases are, for all intent and purposes, evidential cases are this worldly occasions. Like I said, it's a car accident. It's a machine is unplugged. It's these sorts of things. And But what about the heavenly cases? There's virtually no evidence in NDE cases that the heavenly testimonies are true. Now, when a person tells me, I was really there, I saw it, the colors, the comment from Don Piper was very common. They'll start and they'll talk like this. They'll say, well, I wish I could tell you what the colors were like. You think of greens and reds and blues, but I'm not using the right words. I can't tell you these colors were not the greens and reds and blues. They were, never mind, I can't get this across. Then they'll talk about the music and they'll say, you know music and you've heard the best symphony orchestras but this music is like otherworldly. I know I'm not telling you anything. It's like, you'll just have to be there. And that's the way they talk about it. But those are testimonies. I can't verify otherworldly music. I can't verify otherworldly colors and colors nobody has seen before. I can listen. I can benefit. Some of them are really, really incredible testimonies, but no data that they were there. So they can believe they're there, and I would never try to take that away from them. They can say what they want, but here's the key. They're testimonies. I've lived near some Muslim neighbors. I know many others who are Hindu, Buddhist, others. They tell me stories about what they believe. They tell me what their theology is, what differs from this group and this group. I just listen to them. But I can't verify. They don't give me any verification. They just tell me what they believe. And the otherworldly type testimonies, Jesus welcomed me to heaven, and wow, he's a great guy because I'm an atheist. Those kind of stories, I just listen. I say, wow, if that happened, Jesus has got a reason for doing about, and maybe he knows more about you than you do. But I can't verify that. So if you're giving me a testimony about another religion or about something you've had, I listen. We all listen. And then we go, maybe so, maybe no. How do we know? I can't write a book on the evidence that this unbeliever was welcomed to heaven by Jesus because there's just no data for that. I have to use the evidential cases for that. So evidential, just to repeat, evidential cases are almost always this worldly kind of events, not otherworldly events and belief systems. Now, I'm a Christian. So if someone says, well, I'm a Christian, I've been a Christian for 30 years and Jesus said I'm coming back going to heaven, I'm much more inclined to believe that. But even then, I don't have evidence for it. I'm just listening to their testimony. So I think otherworldly colors and sounds, and that's probably true. But was it an angel? How come this person said it was Jesus Christ, the next person says it was an angel? And I just listen. There's no way to tell these apart. So I don't think that's data for one religion over another. You go, well, maybe it's religion. Maybe it's evidence for all religions, or maybe it's evidence for universalism or pluralism. To which I'd say, well, if those things are true, I respect God's ability to bring anybody into heaven he wants. But I think you're not hearing me. That's not evidence for any of these claims, including the Christian ones. Then somebody will say, well, what about the hell ones? Are there hell cases? And I'll say, yeah, about 18 to 20% report hell cases. Well, I'll bet you're a Christian, so you allow the hell cases, don't you? No, they're hell testimonies. I don't know that they were in hell. There's no data.
There's no corroborating ones from hell?
I can't think of any. I mean, no, I would just say no. And for an unbeliever, let's take an opposite case that you're asking. What about an atheist who says, I went to hell? Wow, I'm scared to death, and now I'm thinking maybe your religion is true. Hey, well, I'd like him to think my religion is true. But maybe he was raised in the South, and he went to some revival meetings when he was a child, and he wakes up and thinks there's a
Well, what about the near-death experience of A.G. Ayers, atheist philosopher?
Yeah.
So are you saying, it sounds to me like you're saying, if they're not evidence, they're curious, they're of interest,
but I can't verify or falsify.
You can't verify, so you don't really put much weight on any of them, not even the A.J. Ayers one.
Well, okay, now you're asking different questions in the sense that, am I glad A.J. Ayers, the famous atheist, had the, yeah, I think it's pretty cool. What did it cause him to do? Well, as he got later in his life, he started thinking there was probably some kind of afterlife. And there's even testimonies of things he told people that now he's open to an afterlife. I'm glad he's open to an afterlife. And as a Christian, I hope he made some kind of decision or commitment for Christ, but I have no evidence of it. I can listen. I can say, I hope, but no, I can't say the hell cases had to be hell cases. You had to be in hell. You can be dead convinced they are, and I'm amused that you're not. I mean, amused makes it sound like I don't believe it. I could think, oh, that's really something, and you became a Christian. Yeah, I became a Christian as a result. I'm glad you became a Christian, but I can't write a paper on how I know you were in hell.
Okay, so it sounds to me like you wouldn't place any more evidential value on the near-death experience of atheist A.J. Ayer than you would that of Don Piper or of any Christian or non-Christian
With,
who have a heavenly
without
experience.
without data, they're about the same. They're
They're all
testimony
curious,
that I
but
have to curious. I listen. If I'm blessed, I'm glad I'm blessed. If it backs up my view, I'm glad it backs up my view. But I don't sit there and say, from now on, I have more evidences for my view because all these people went to heaven and met Jesus. That's not an evidence for my religion. I need the cases where they were taken on flat on their backs and moved into the ambulance, so they couldn't sit up, stand up. They were unconscious. Later, they report the number on the top of the ambulance is way
yeah.
over their head. They can't see it. That's an evidence case, but that's about a guy out in the street looking at a number, not for Christianity.
All right. There's a question from Vanessa Chavez. What do you think about Bill Wise's testimony of hell? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
Okay. So once I asked you, I don't know if I asked you or was it Michael Sabom, the cardiologist who has written a few books on near-death experiences. What do you think is the most interesting, the most evidential, the most evidenced one? And Michael Sabom told me the story of Pamela Reynolds. Would you agree with that?
I don't think Pam Reynolds is the best of the evidential cases.
Oh, okay.
There were some. Mike wrote that a long time ago. I mean, like a real long time ago. But
no, I had lunch with him about 2 years ago, and he still was thinking Pamela Reynolds was the best.
Okay, that book, if I'm not mistaken, came out in 1998. Okay. There have been 23 years of evidence, and the best book with evidence cases is in a book called "The Self Does Not Die," yeah. And it's got over 100 evidence cases, and it's post Mike's story by quite a bit. I think the ones in that book, they have 36 cases of evidential cases where the person had no measurable, that's the key, measurable, no measurable brain or heart activity. Those are, to me, highly evidential. And some of the evidence during those highly evident states are themselves very evidential. So now Mike in his first book, Recollections of Death, A Medical Perspective, I think 1982, Mike does have a good chapter in there on some evidential cases. But again, they're all this worldly. Some person remembers the dials on the machines that were measuring them while they were in surgery. Well, how did they know that? It was up over their head and over their shoulder. Well, they said they're up above the body, and they're just curiously reading the dials of the woman who saw the machine unplugged. One of them, a really weird one, we know that operating chambers are sometimes close side by side, and this person drifted through the wall and saw a person having their leg amputated in the next room, and they took the amputated leg and put it in a yellow garbage bag-like thing. I don't know if it was for testing or what. But if I were telling the story about a person having an amputated leg, I don't know what what the listeners would think, but I'd say, oh, it's going to be a black bag because I picture a garbage bag or something like that. A yellow bag?
They'd say they don't believe you because you wouldn't have a leg to stand on.
That's great. That's good. But either that guy was happening there and it was a yellow bag or not, and her surgeon got information from the other guy next door, and they could verify these things. So, notice they're all this worldly. I don't say every last one, but the really heavy ones. You say, well, what about that guy who was dead? And he said, your cousin died in Afghanistan. Well, that's evidence, but just because the guys are in heaven, it's not evidence for heaven. It's evidence of an earthly event, namely a war in Afghanistan or Iraq, and a guy dies and they get a telegram. Notice the confirmation is earthly stuff, even if it was given in a heavenly surrounding. I don't know if the heavenly surrounding part is true or the hell part.
Okay.
So,
Anthony Biondi, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Forgive me if I didn't, but thank you for the super chat. Appreciate that. Also, Caleb Jackson, thank you for the super chat. And Caleb says, he's got a question for you.
Okay.
What are your views on the 2014 AWARE study done on NDEs, where patients were unable to see written messages set up for the experiment?
Yeah, many things. By the way, there are a few cases now of verification. They're very few, given all the cases they've done. But here's a couple responses. Some of the medical personnel would say, well, if what these guys saw is true, and they're all of a sudden going, wow, I have this ethereal body and it feels really, really cool. And I'm looking down and I'm not happy to see my spouse. They're crying, but I see the doctor and they're beating on my chest. And wow, I wonder what I can see here. And the minute you get in a world like that, you start going, oh man, look at this and this and this and this. You're not looking for a number somewhere. So I think the very state you're in, if it's true that there's music you never heard before, most beautiful colors ever, I'm looking there and not looking for your silly number that you want me to report. That's one thing. But number two, in that book and other places, there are a number of numbers. A number of times there are numbers, not in the aware study, but there are numbers like I had no two cases of the number on top of the ambulance where the person is strapped down. They tell you what the number on the ambulance is, and it's verified. There's a famous case of a quarter, a 25-cent piece being found up top, I think it was 1982, and they reported the number on the quarter. You go, well, come on, then it's either going to be 19 or 20. Okay, so that's 50-50. How about the last two numbers? It could be anywhere from, let's say, 1975 to 2021. A lot of numbers there. And you said it was 1982, and they checked out 1982. It's a penny that's been found up on top. One of my favorites is a gal who was up above her body, and she looked down on the top of one of the medical machines that was over people's heads. There was a number, and I don't know if it was marked in a non-erase marker, or if it's something that's riveted in so they could track this machine around the hospital. Where is it now? We need it. Oh, it's over on floor 7. But she looked down, there was a 12-digit number on top of this machine. And when she came to, she said to the nurses, quick, write this down. She said, I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and I have a tendency to memorize big numbers. And the number on top of that machine right there is whatever it was, 567-432, and they copied it down. Well, the nurses didn't think much of it, I guess. They put it in their purse, and later they had to move that machine, so they sent a guy in to take it somewhere else. And they said, before you go, run up there on top, get yourself a little ladder and see if you can get up there and tell us what that number is. And the guy did that, and they got their numbers out of their purse. It just happened a few days before, and he read the number down, and she was exactly right. Okay, that's not an aware number. This could be bigger than the aware numbers. This is 12 digits. Now, I had a mathematician, a professor of math. I'm forgetting his testimony, so don't blame this. I'm forgetting his number, but don't blame this on the mathematician. He said to have 12 numbers in a row and to get everyone right. I think he said there's one chance in a billion. It might have been 1 in a million, but he says one chance in a billion that you would hit 12 straight numbers without a miss. And so what if it doesn't show up in the aware study? It shows up in other things where there's numbers on top. So I think, number one, you're too excited about what's around you. I could care less about your number. And number two, there are number reports that are verifiable. That 12 number one, I think, is very impressive. Oh, by the way, I know a fellow who did some research, and he found, you know how the way finding a person is today on the internet, he found the nurse who was in the room who had the 12-digit number read to her. And he said, he's working, talking back and forth with her. And he said, what'd you think? She said, well, I wrote the number down. And what did the guy say? He said the same number. How did that affect you? And I'll always remember this. He said, he's got this in writing. The gal said, imagine this. The nurse said, it was the most important thing that ever happened to me in my life. Why? Why was hearing a 12-digit? Because maybe she was a skeptic. Maybe she didn't think there was an afterlife. Maybe she was looking for evidence for her belief, whatever it was. And she thought, wow, there's a heaven. There must be life after death. That's why a 12-digit number is most. So here's a case that didn't just have backup and confirmation and 2 people were present, but a case where it changed somebody's life. It just, you got like everything rolled into one number. So I don't want to say I could care less. I hope they get some things in those aware studies, but there are other things that answer all the questions.
Cool. Jim Amberg, thank you for the super chat. He says, are you guys working on any projects right now other than Dr. H's massive project? Thanks for all you both do. Thanks, Jim. What do you say?
Yeah, I've been working on that resurrection. I think next spring will be my 8th or my 9th year in the spring. And I have a research assistant. He's got a PhD too, but he's great. He's a great help. And we're working our heads off right now on the
Ben Shaw. You're going to hear that name in the future, I promise. He knows a lot about the resurrection of Jesus. He knows a ton about it. You don't know him right now. He got his PhD a year ago. About a year ago, was it?
Yeah, and he does master's and PhD dissertations on the resurrection.
And he's good. He knows his stuff. He
He
really
does.
does.
And what's neat about him is we're both working on this manuscript. It's killing both of us. We're both working long hours. And you know what's really, really neat? If something happens to me, let's say I have a heart attack today, Ben has agreed to finish the study for me. The thing's already written. It's over 5,000 pages, but there'll be a lot of editing to do. And it'd be Ben who talks to the editors and says, yeah, let's let that go. Let's take this phrase out. I know him. He'd do it this way. So I'm real thankful for him, what he's doing. So, yeah, that's a killer. On NDEs,
Hold on. So when is the? Let's talk about that magnum opus for a second.
first
We don't.
volume.
The first volume. When do you think that's going to come out? I know you don't have a publisher yet. You got some interested.
Oh, I got a contract. I got a contract. It's for mine for the taking. But if I don't know, but I
Ballpark.
hope the first one is out by a year from this December, or maybe a year from January or February. So maybe in 14 months.
Wow.
That's volume one. But volume one is 1,600 pages, and it's nothing but evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Only evidence. The second volume is a naturalistic theories, all the comebacks you can think of, and it's 1,100 pages long. So we do a lot of comebacks. So wow, it's wearing me out.
So the first one, 1,500 pages, you say?
16 manuscript pages. They say it's going to be 1,150 in print.
Wow. So if those of you who are familiar with mine is, I think, around 716 pages in print, and yours is going to be about 1,150
just on evidence
print
alone.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Now on the NDEs, I've got this major thing I did. It was a debate. It's a series of debates. It's the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, with a lot of the top pro and con. We're dualists. No, there's only one part of you, and when you die, it's all over. Debates. It's almost 500 pages long, and I wrote a long a dialogue chapter in there for NDEs. Well, I've been asked to do a second one like it, and it'll be probably 50% longer, and another scientific work on NDEs, and it's probably due to be out in about another year or two. So that's another follow-up, another one of these many NDE cases divided into 5 categories. And by the way, one of the main things we concentrated on that second one is the same question that's already been asked today. Are the heavenly testimonies evidence for any one religion? And my argument is no, not at all.
And Jim, I'm working on 2 things right now. So one, Lee Martin McDonald, I interviewed him a little over a year ago on the formation of the biblical canon, and we have 5 videos that's on our YouTube channel on this. So one is on the formation of the Old Testament canon. The second video pertains to the Apocrypha, or those intertestamental books that you find in the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. Why aren't they in the Protestant Bible? Why are they in these other Bibles? What are we to think of them? Then we have 2 interviews, 2 videos on the formation of the New Testament canon, and then a 5th video that has to do with miscellaneous matters pertaining to the formation of the canon. So what Lee and I have done is we had those transcribed, and then we have reformatted these questions and looked through things so that we weren't speaking off the cuff, that we really thought through the answers a little bit more and beefed up the answers and added some new questions. So right now it's like answers to 100 questions pertaining to the formation of the Bible. So that we're looking for a publisher now. That'll probably be out within the next 2 years. That's going to be a pretty cool book. Easy read, more of a question answer interview format, and then I push back on certain things and we delve deeper into some of the questions. In fact, Lee said what got him thinking about it is he said, you ask some questions that aren't typically asked, but that people do wonder about. Like, in Jude 14, it mentions a quote from First Enoch as though it's scripture, as though it's divinely inspired. But no scholar that I know of thinks that Enoch wrote First Enoch. So was Jude wrong? What does that have to do with the doctrine of biblical inerrancy? Or divine inspiration of Scripture? How are we to look at First Enoch and things like that? So we delve into some questions like that, and there are a few matters on which Lee and I have disagreement, and so we kind of go back and forth in some of those. It's going to be an interesting book. And then the second project I'm working on, I've been doing this for a little while now, is a popular version and a less technical version of my work on gospel differences. But I get into things and explain things in a simpler way, like the synoptic problem. And I'm going to have 2 chapters, one on the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, how are we to understand it, and another one on divine inspiration. I find that Bill Craig and I have very similar thoughts because he's working kind of on the same thing, and we're working independently of one another. And when I shared some things with him, he said, wow, he was having very similar thoughts. So that's a real fun, and it's going to be geared for small group use. So yeah, an individual can use it very easily, but it will be easy for small groups to use it as well, and discussion questions along the way. So those are the 2 things that I'm working on at present. So yeah, thanks for asking that question. All right. Well, we've been talking for, close to 50 minutes now on near-death experiences. Let's transition to resurrection. We were talking about your magnum opus that you're working on. It seems to me that near-death experiences are pretty cool because they do give a minimalistic, even scientific evidence, you might say, for an afterlife, at least a minimalistic afterlife.
Right.
And it's like, whoa, if you've got that resurrection, I mean, that creates background knowledge in which
it's like hand in glove.
Yeah, resurrection.
Afterlife, here comes the resurrection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about resurrection some. You all can start sending some questions now. If you have some more on NDEs, that's cool.
But the first one there from was his name Mike? The very first question?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, Mike, the Muslim. What was his question, though? Oh, about the crucifixion of Jesus. You want to deal with that? Why believe that Jesus was crucified rather than the Muslim view that God spared him from death?
Because the historical evidence for resurrection, well, that too, but the historical evidence for the crucifixion is so strong. Now, we never argue, in spite of what people say about arguments, we never argue that something's true because the critics say so. But here's an interesting insight. If the crucifixion of Jesus is allowed by all the scholars, say, related fields, New Testament, theology, philosophy, history, classics, people who deal with those strata of evidence, it's allowed by people there's many writings in those fields by atheists, agnostics, skeptics, just people with natural bents toward, they disbelieve everything. And then Christians, moderates, they all say it's the crucifixion happened. Now, John Dominic Ross and the late Marcus Borg, 2 skeptics, both said the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion is the firmest fact in the ancient world, or the firmest fact in the life of Jesus. Now, that doesn't make it true. I want to be clear. All the scholars, every last one of them, could be wrong. But when scholars who are not Christians, not theists, agnostics, and others, when they all agree the evidence is good, that makes me want to look at the evidence. That's what it does. It points me back to the evidence, which is the all-important thing here. And we have both medical and textual evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. You can do whatever you want to that evidence. You can take it with a grain of salt. You can say, I don't like this author, I'll throw him out. You will always have enough to answer the question. Now, the medical questions, for example, isn't it interesting that we have accounts in the ancient world from ancient writers pertaining to hundreds and really thousands of crucifixions? They're described. Now, interestingly, they're not described to a T, because as one author, the great New Testament scholar Martin Hingel says, crucifixion was so wicked and so nasty, and maybe the worst kind of death a person could undergo. People didn't sit there and talk a lot of details because in that day and age, they were much less open to gory things.
It was disturbing.
It's very disturbing. But still, they tell you a lot of cases, and you read a lot. Josephus is alive in Jerusalem. He was born just a few years after Jesus died. And he's alive in Jerusalem while thousands of Jews are crucified just outside Jerusalem's walls. And of all the cases we have, not one person gets down off the cross alive from a completed crucifixion. Now, Josephus tells us in his autobiography, of 3 friends he finds on the cross, and he got permission from the Roman emperor, please take so-and-so down. They took these 3 fellows down. And what shows you how strong death by crucifixion is they gave them Roman medical help, and they tried to nurse all 3 men back to health. 2 of them died, and 1 lived, even though they were off the cross and no longer being crucified. You go, well, isn't that an example of somebody who missed it? No, they were taken down. They were taken down while they were alive. It was not. My comment was, we don't have a case of completed crucifixion where the person lived. They knew how to kill people. And I think there's a couple of really, that's just a historical aside.
Yeah, and Herodotus mentions one as well. I didn't know this until I read Dale Allison's book, and he gives an example from Herodotus who says a guy was intentionally removed from the cross and survived the crucifixion. But even so, as what was it, Strauss, who mentioned over a century ago that even if Jesus had been removed intentionally from the cross while alive, what would he have looked like a few days later? I mean, you got to imagine he's in the tomb, and they do something to kind of to keep him alive, to help him. What does he look like a few days later? Certainly he'd convince them that he was alive, but not resurrected with an immortal body.
And that is one of 2 arguments that I think, there are a lot of good arguments against the view that Jesus remained alive, but 2 of the takeaway ones you really want to remember. One is the David Strauss critique, which he makes a little bit in his 1835 to 1837 Life of Jesus, called The Life of Jesus. But 30 years later, he wrote a follow-up, Life of Jesus for the German People. And he has this famous comment that he says, here's the problem with saying Jesus didn't die. The problem is, let's just say he was taken down and he was half dead, 3/4 dead, whatever. A few days later, he struggles out of the tomb. What does he do with the rock? What does he do with no food or water? What does he do with no medical help? He walks to where the disciples are. How far is that? I don't know. Let's just say it's a 1/4 mile. When he gets to the disciples with bloody feet, he's worked them open. He's got that side wound woke from. He's pale. He's bloody, ghastly looking. He's hunched over, can hardly do anything. And here's the joke, Strauss says. He walks into the room where the disciples are and, guys, I told you that I would rise again from the dead. And they would look at him and say, alive? Yes. Praise the Lord. He spared him, and we can nurse him with medicine. Praise God. As we often say, a doctor could be used in healing. But risen, he isn't. He's not risen. And I don't want a risen body like his. And as I've been saying for years and years and years, you got Peter going, go get this, get the doctor, bring in a pan of water, get this. And Andrew's over the corner going, oh, praise the Lord, someday I'm going to have a body just like this one. The problem is that the view doesn't work. So if Jesus looked like a phrase we used in the 60s, if Jesus looked like death warmed over, he's not going to make people radiant and proclaim. Well, maybe they thought about it for a while, right, but then they don't go out and they're willing to give the rest of their life. So Strauss's critique, I can tell you, till this day, when critics, unbelievers, and others talk about the crucifixion, Strauss's critique is the -- reason why people think Jesus died on the cross. The second one is that we're told that the centurion, to make sure he was dead, had Jesus pierced in the chest, and blood and water came up. A lot of work has been done on this, medical work on cadavers, on living people. They don't stab living people, but they use living people in their research. And there is a Roman source by Quintilian, and he says the centurion gives up the bodies to the families to be buried once they're taken down from the cross and pierced to make sure. And the Latin word for pierced there is in the most scholarly study on crucifixion by a guy named Cook.
It's like percussus or
It's
something
the
like
word
that.
percussus, and the word is almost always used in the literature of a death scene, a battle scene, and percussus is performed. Cook argues, percussus is performed with a spear, a sword, or an axe. And if you hit a guy in the chest with a spear, a sword, or an axe, and that person is already 3/4 dead on this theory, that's going to be a Roman source that says they just didn't let people get away from their watch. They're not, in Acts 13, there's,
Hold on. So what you're saying right here with Strauss's critique and what you're saying there with percussus and so forth, that answers a skeptic who says, how do we know Jesus died? But it really doesn't answer the Muslim view. And, I probably got us off track by bringing up Strauss's critique. It doesn't answer the Muslim view because, in fairness to the Muslim, they would say the Quran, and I think it's Surah 4, verses 157, 58, something like that, says that God made it appeared that Jesus died, but he didn't die. He only made it appear that way. So God took him up to heaven at that point. And so the way I would address that would be to say, look, the earliest Christians, that is Jesus' disciples, were out there proclaiming that Jesus had died and that God had raised him from the dead. Now, on several occasions, the Quran refers to Jesus' disciples as Muslims. So why would an all-wise God of the Quran, why would he allow the disciples to mistakenly believe that Jesus had actually died and that God had raised him from the dead, and from that message perpetuate the largest religion in the world today? It seems like that wouldn't be very wise of God. And we can understand why God would deceive the Romans and the Jewish leadership who had Jesus crucified. But as my friend David Wood says, if we can understand why God would deceive them and allow them to be deceived, but why would he deceive the disciples of Jesus, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims? And if he is willing to deceive those Muslims, then how do you know he's not deceiving you? I think that is an interesting question that needs to be addressed. And then another thing is, we can establish on a historical basis that Jesus very likely predicted his imminent death and resurrection. So if Jesus did not actually die, well, then that would make him a false prophet. But the Quran refers to him as a great prophet. On the other hand, if he did die and rise from the dead, then as he predicted, well, then the Quran is wrong there too, because it says he didn't. Either way, it seems to me that the Quran is mistaken pertaining to the fate of Jesus. So I think there's a number of problems with the Muslim view.
The New Testament sources we have, this stuff material is just coming out. The earliest material in the New Testament is not the Gospel of Mark at plus 30. It's not the first epistle of Paul, 1 Thessalonians at plus 20. There is new creedal data and work being done on it that dates the resurrection, crucifixion, everything back to immediately after the event. Now, this would be a long story. Very early evidence for the death of Jesus and the resurrection, right at 30 AD. Several scholars have said it's right from 30 AD. The Muslim source is almost exactly to the year 600 years later. As historical sources, I'm not surprised that a Muslim would believe the Quran, and I wouldn't be surprised that a Christian would believe the Gospels. That's the way religion works. But if my source is right after the event, and the source that denies it is 600 years later, I think historically that's rough. I've got a book on my shelf at home written by a Muslim apologist, and he's debating a Christian. And he says, be ready, Muslims. Almost always they're going to say the New Testament goes back to the same century. It's right after the cross at 30-ish AD, but the Quran is 600 years later. And this Muslim scholar says, and they are correct. 600 years later is not a good historical argument. He said, but whenever they say that to me, here's what I say to them. But your Gospels have mistakes. Let's talk about the mistakes in the Gospels. In other words, he turns the page. He goes to another question. And these guys who are atheist New Testament scholars, they think there's errors all over the New Testament. That does not bother them one bit. I'm just saying on the surface, 600 years later is not good history. It doesn't qualify as a comment on an event from 600 years later. If it were the American Revolution, we're not even there for almost 400 more years. That's how long that time is. And when the critics are saying, yeah, this is a good source, that's 600 years later, again, I don't blame Muslims for believing that, but it's not a good historical argument. This Muslim writer that I have says it's not a good argument. So he changes the subject to the New Testament.
Excellent. So if you have any more questions about the resurrection, please go ahead and type them in now, and we'll ask Gary of these questions. So Gary, what do you think is our very best source when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus?
If you're talking, okay.
If you could only have one source.
If you mean one person or one writing?
One person. Yeah.
One person, it's unanimous. It's not even close. All the New Testament scholars, and again, I mean this seriously, they can be non-Christian, they can be atheists, they can be some other religion, anything. By far, the number one witness they will tell you is Paul. The Jesus Seminar says that. Michael Barton, an adamant atheist, they'll say the best source is Paul because Paul has given us eyewitness testimony. And his earliest epistle, by the way, at 50 AD is only 20 years later. But I will say as a category of evidence, these early creedal sources I'm talking about from 30 AD to 50 AD, they are by far, as many people are now saying, they're the strongest sorts of evidence because we have data from the apostles that go back to the same date as the crucifixion. That is strong, strong evidence.
Awesome. So I see Lioness for Jesus is asking me to comment on Matthew 27:53. And this is 52 and 53 talk about when Jesus dies, the sun goes dark, the sun is dark, there's darkness, there's an earthquake, the temple veil splits, the rocks split, the tombs are open, and many of the dead saints come out and are raised from the dead. And after Jesus is raised on Easter morning, then they come out of their tombs and walk into the holy city and are appear to many. So what do I do with those? This was something that became, I guess you could say, infamous from a few years ago, because in my large book on the resurrection of Jesus, I posited that what the mention of the many saints that were raised and came out and walked around, that this was more of like special effects, like a poetic device. In ancient literature, we call them portents. And so you find something similar when Julius Caesar died. You have, I think it's no less than 6 ancient authors that talk about things like a comet appeared, there was darkness. You've got Livy, the Roman historian, who at one point he is writing in poetic kind of genre. He's saying that Mount Etna erupted, there was a comet, that streams stopped flowing, black intestines were seen outside of cattle, that pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. So you find these kind of things. Cassius Dio reports that I think it was when Caesar went into Egypt, that a woman with snakes for hair was walking around the city, and that the gate to the temple of Jupiter, with Zeus, that took many men to open, they opened by themselves. Comet, darkness, all that kind of stuff, voices heard in the forest. Josephus reports a number of portents just prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. A cow gave birth to a lamb. There was a comet. There was a bright light in the middle of the night that was brighter than the brightness of day that shone down on the temple. The gates to the Jerusalem temple that took more than 20 men to opened by themselves. So you can see this kind of stuff. There's a pattern. It's kind of like we would say today, 9/11 was an earth-shaking event here in the U.S. Well, we don't really mean that there was an earthquake that radiated around the world. It's a figure of speech. It's a portent kind of thing to say that an event of great significance took place. And my view, and I wouldn't die for this view, but I lean toward the view that this is what Matthew is doing here. He has added some portents that are going on in order to highlight the importance of Jesus' death, that they have actually killed the Son of God. So that's what I think of this. So if we want to say, well, did this is this a legend that developed over time? No, it isn't a legend that developed over time. Is this fiction? No, it's not. This is a portent that is the same thing that other ancient authors, including the Jewish historian Josephus, was doing. I'll give you some biblical ones. So in Joel chapter 2, it talks about the day of the Lord, that the sun will go dark, the stars will fall out of the sky, the moon will turn to blood. Joel chapter 2. Well, you find at Pentecost, you've got, they're speaking in tongues, and some of the audience are saying, hey, these guys are filled with new wine. And Peter gets up and he says, no, this is what Joel the prophet spoke of when he said, the sun will go dark and the moon will turn to blood. And whoever calls the Spirit of God will manifest itself, something like that. And whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so he says, this has happened in your midst today, he's basically saying. And then he calls on them. He says, today's the day of salvation. Call on the name of the Lord to be saved. So, well, did the sun go dark? No. Did the moon turn to blood? No. Yeah, that's the way it happened back then. And that's what I think is going on in our situation here. So I don't think it's fiction. I don't think it's meant to be understood historically. We have to understand the genre. Now, I don't think Gary agrees with me on this, and that's something in which we just disagree. And I might be wrong on it. Like I said, I wouldn't die for it, but that's what I think is going on. And I think there's some theological challenges to the view that these things actually happened. Now, in order to plug in the Wi-Fi, I had to take out the power plug. So it's showing my battery is only 9%. So we're going to have to wrap this up very soon. So we've got Angel WVM. Thank you for the super chat. And she says, what do you say to atheists who say there's no evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb outside of the Gospels? What do you say to that, Gary?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb outside of Jerusalem. Let's put it this way.
You know what? This is really going down quickly. Now we're at 6%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug the Wi-Fi, which means it's not going to be as strong, okay, the signal, and I apologize for that. Hopefully we'll still be able to go through. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to plug in the power again. So go ahead and answer that question.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence for a burial in the specific case of Jesus. It is true that ancient peoples, Romans included, used to throw bodies in pits, or the most common form of burial was a rectangular hole in the ground, and the body would be laid there and poured on top of it. Now the question is, did the general view happen to Jesus, or a specific view, given on the other hand that he was in Jerusalem when he died? And Jerusalem was the place where the tombs are cut out of limestone. And could somebody on Jesus' behalf, a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, could a rich man have buried him in that tomb? There's a lot of indications that he was buried in the tomb and not elsewhere. Now, we even have some sources that tell us that
we're freezing. Go ahead. Keep talking. Sorry about this, folks. I see we're starting to freeze. Go ahead.
We even have sources, Josephus is one of them, that tells us that, I think Philo is another one, that tells us that the Jews cared so much for the resurrection of the body that they would even bury crucifixion or other victims killed by the state, even as criminals. They had enough care for the body that they did bury them. So in Jerusalem, we have a statement even about crucifixion victims. Plus, we have evidences for Jesus' burial. The story there is there are multiple sources for Jesus' burial in a tomb. And the way that critics count multiple sources, it depends on who you ask. They could say 3 sources or 4 sources, but certainly the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John count separately. And we have an Acts, what's called a sermon summary, it's like a creed, an early sermon summary in Acts 13, where Jesus is buried. And we have that most highly accepted creed is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following. And there we read that Jesus died, was buried, rose, and appeared. And even Bart Ehrman says those go together, because how do you know he was crucified? How do you know he died? Because he was buried. How do you know he was resurrected? Because he appeared. So the foursome goes together. And so we have an early creed, 1 Corinthians 15, an Acts sermon summary, Acts 13, three synoptic gospels. John is always counted as a separate source. We have multiple attestation. I won't go on and on and on, but there's some evidence right there. They did bury people killed by the state, including crucifixion. We have specific case saying Richmond took part in Jesus' burial. We have multiple attestation for that. And there's nothing illogical at all about someone being put in a tomb, because hundreds of people were buried in tombs in the Jerusalem area. So I think the evidence is really strong. The chapter that I wrote for my big magnum opus on how was Jesus buried, what's the evidence say, was 60 pages long. That's a lot of pages to describe the historical data for this event.
Okay. All right, just a few more questions here, and I'm going to try to give as short answers as possible, since we're finding lags in the recording here. You know what? Maybe I can do something. All right, so the audio is going to change here for a moment, then I'll change it back. All right, so hang with me for a moment.
The power saved in 5 minutes.
Yep. And now we're going to take this and plug it in. Now we should be good.
Pretty good at that.
Ah, okay. I think we still look at the let's see. Just look at the. We'll look at the camera, but that's what it's going to be showing. Okay. All right, let me pull up these questions. So I was asked from Bobby Q, why have you stopped using the one fact approach to the resurrection of Jesus, using the disciples' appearances and building a case from there? Hey, let me just make sure that I've got the right mic here. Okay, now that should sound better. I still use it, Bobby Q. I still use it now. I just started using it again about a year or two ago when I speak to churches, because it is a pretty simple argument for the resurrection of Jesus, and people can understand it really well. I just used it a couple of weeks ago when I was, where was I? Topeka, Kansas. I was speaking to some high schoolers, really sharp, and like a prep school, some high schoolers. And then I loved it. So I do use it for audiences. I don't typically use it when I'm talking to a more sophisticated or academic audience or during a debate. I might try it sometime because I really like it. All right. JAI Apologetics. What are Dr. Habermas's thoughts on Pincus Lapide? Are his views unique in that a non-Christian scholar accepts the resurrection? What do you think, Doc?
Well, Pincus Lapide's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish perspective, it's a pretty good argument. It's about 40 years old now. But, for example, in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, which he calls the best evidence of the resurrection, a lot of people would agree on that. He gives, I think, 9 evidences that this is a very early report from maybe as early as a year after the crucifixion. It's one of those creeds. And he calls 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, he says it's so strong it may be used as the evidence of eyewitnesses. So that's pretty powerful. Then he goes on and says, I'm Jewish, but I believe Jesus was raised from the dead. I believe the evidence is pretty strong. And he says, I'm a Pharisee when it comes to how Jesus was raised, and he was raised bodily. And then he makes a play on a theory that was popularized about 100 years ago by a Jewish academic named Franz Rosenwig. And Rosenwig held a really interesting view. He says, Jews come to God through the law because that's the way God set it up. So that makes maybe, 30, 40 million people in the world come to God through the law. But everybody else, Rosenwig said, Jesus is the Gentile Messiah, and they come through Jesus. So everybody but the Jews comes to God through Jesus Christ. And And Lapide says, I'm Jewish, so I get there the traditional way. But Jesus is for y'all. Jesus is for the rest of you. And what you do with him is very, very important. So he goes on and makes the application, pay attention to this fella, it's the key to eternal life, and so on and so on. But he definitely believes in the resurrection of Jesus. So, I mean, as a scholar, let me tell you this about Pinchas Lapide. He had a PhD in New Testament. And I heard him say at the time that he was one of only 4 Jewish scholars in the world who had accredited PhDs in New Testament. And since then, a book's been written on Jewish scholars, and really good testimonies. It's fairly, I mean, you find a lot of Jewish scholars who believe Jesus was a prophet, and a few that he was raised from the dead. So I like Pinchas Lapide's book. He's not the best known New Testament scholar in the world, but he's got a really good PhD from Germany.
All right, thanks. Jim Amborg, I thank you for the super chat, and yes, I will apply that $20 toward getting a new power strip. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? Have you come to a conclusion about where Jesus first appears to the disciples after his death? Billy G asks me, Mike. No, I haven't. I flip back and forth. So in my book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? At the very end, I assess the resurrection narratives and the differences there. And so you've got Matthew and Mark, which strongly suggest that the first appearance to the group of male disciples occurs in Galilee, whereas Luke and John place it in Jerusalem. So what is going on there? And at first I used to say that, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to just cut this short, just because, so I'm not going to get into a lot of details here. Bottom line is I have flip-flopped back and forth. I do think that one group has changed it. Either Matthew following Mark has changed it, or Luke and John have changed it. And sometimes I think Luke and John have changed it, and that the first appearance to the disciples was in Galilee, and other times I think it was in Jerusalem. I'm agnostic with that right now. I really don't know who changed it and why they changed it. I can't even give you an educated guess, to be honest with you. However, I do think that one of them changed it for a specific reason, though I just can't name that reason. And I'm not saying that as a punt, because I don't want to say there's an error there. I don't think there's an error there. I think that it's intentional that one changed it, and there's a reason behind it. I am fine with saying I think there are probably a half dozen candidates in the Gospels that are reasonable candidates for being errors. But I don't think this is one of them.
Can I make a one sentence?
Yeah, go for it.
I will say this. According to the Gospels, if you don't say male disciples, if you say to any disciple, the first appearance was in Jerusalem, because in Matthew, who depicts the Galilee appearance, he appears to the women first as they leave the tomb, and in John, he appears to Mary Magdalene first, and there's a hint of that in what's called pseudo-Mark, the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark that most people think aren't in the original. So the first appearance was to the female disciples, if you count that for disciples, was in Jerusalem. And I think probably
that's Matthew, Mark, right? It's in John.
Matthew and John and long Mark.
It's also in Luke, when he appears to them that evening after the Emmaus disciples.
To the male disciples, yeah, that's your theory of why did he do. But the women are in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
As far as a reason why 2 of them would say Jerusalem and 2 would be Galilee, I would say each person preserved the story in their geographical region that made the most sense to them. They can tell what's important to them, and Matthew can, I think that's a good reason for the reason, why they do it. But I would just say women are disciples. They're never called disciples in the Gospels, by the way. But women were disciples there, and Jesus sees them first. So those that'll be last will be first.
So Angel WVM says, haha, I am a male, but it's all right. Here's another super chat just because I love you guys and Jesus loves you too. Thank you so much, Angel. Sorry for calling you a she there. All right, let's see. What do we have? Anything else? Any final things? All right. boy, I don't want to pronounce his name because I know I would. It starts with an H and has a Q in it as well. Thank you for the super chat. And this person says, what is the best attested miracle claim outside of Christianity? How does it compare to the resurrection? Doc, what do you think?
Well, if you said outside of Christianity, if you just left it the best claim outside, I would say it's Jesus' non-resurrection miracles, because critics, I've even heard a critical scholar say something I wouldn't say. He said it's unanimous among critics today that Jesus was a miracle worker. Okay, so I think some of Jesus' miracles are fantastic. Outside, I don't think there's anything to compare to the resurrection. It sounds prejudiced, but let me tell you why. In all the major religions, with all the major religious founders, none of their Orthodox followers claim that their follower was raised from the dead. So there's no claim that's in the ballpark. I mean, maybe you say, well, we got a whole lot of evidence for a healing here. But healings occur when we pray for people every day. I mean, to me, that's not really unique. But the resurrection is really unique. So I'd say there's no takers.
Okay. Well, let me ask you something as we really begin wrapping this up now. What do you say to the person who says, well, science proves that resurrections can't happen? We know that when a person dies, they remain dead, and we observe this, as Hume would say, with an exceptionless regularity. So why believe some ancient text that would say something that is contrary to what we know from science?
First of all, we have an incredible bit of evidence from over 30 sources in the ancient time, within 100 years, which is Bart Ehrman's, the atheist New Testament scholars, demarcation. We have a lot of evidence. But here's where I would say to that person, I would go, time out, time out. You think there's no evidence for another world and no evidence for a resurrection? Let's talk about near-death experiences, or in the case of healings, let's talk about modern-day healings. Craig Keener has just come out with his third miracles book. J.P. Moreland just wrote his first. There are some incredible miracle claims, pre- and post-MRIs, CAT scans, X-rays, great cases. So that kind of bashes that scientific view, this doesn't happen. But let's go back to NDEs. If NDEs say there's an afterlife, and resurrection concerns the afterlife, that gives a foot up to these incredible dozens of evidences for the resurrection. If we already know there's an evidence, we already know there's a resurrection, that kind of bashes the comment that says these things don't happen because there's no afterlife. There is an afterlife. Now what do you do with the evidence for the resurrection? And I think at that point, NDEs deliver a major blow to skeptics who say these things don't happen. And by the way, recent scholarship has it. Those of you who think David Hume is the be-all, end-all, recent scholarship, including the agnostic, I understand, writer Ehrman, Hume's abject failure, criticism today is going against David Hume on the nature of his argument as philosophy.
You know, I think about what I would just add to that is I think when Hume states that kind of balancing argument, it's falsely presented. So what we know from science, what science reveals, is that when people die, they remain dead when left to themselves. So if you're leaving all of this up to natural causes, a person is going to die. They're going to stay dead. They're not coming back to life. And this is what we observe with an exceptionless regularity. But if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the probability of Jesus being raised is 100%. And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, that changes everything. God is a game changer. Why is that? Because maybe someone will say, well, Mike, you're special pleading. No, I'm not. And here's why. Let's just change it just for a moment from someone rising from the dead to someone walking on water. And let's say that the world community decided, well, we want to see if anyone can walk on water. And so all the governments work together on this, and everybody who's living in a particular country has to check in with an official, and they have to attempt to walk on water, be it a swimming pool, a stream, a lake, a pond, whatever. It's got to be something where, they could sink and not be able to walk on water. And so they go through nearly 7 billion people who live in our world today. And finally you come down, all of them sink. None of them are able to walk on water. Finally, you've got a 5-year-old boy, and he's at a swimming pool, and they say, all right, go ahead and try. And he says, well, I can't do it. There's no way I can do it. And I say to him, well, give me your hands. And so he gives me his hands, and I hold him over the swimming pool, supporting his weight. And then I walk alongside the swimming pool, and he walks on water. So 7 billion people unable to walk on water doesn't tell us anything about whether that little boy would be able to walk on water. We say, well, Mike, That's cheating because you're an external agent that assisted him. Exactly. Exactly. The fact of an external agent that would assist someone, that changes things. 7 billion people unable to walk on water unassisted says nothing about whether someone could walk on water assisted. And in the same way, 100 billion people unable to rise from the dead by natural causes tells us nothing pertaining to whether God raised Jesus from the dead. It's an entirely different reference class. So what science informs us is that people cannot come back from the dead by natural causes. The challenge there is the problem with them saying, we observe this with an exceptionalist regularity that people don't come back to life. Yeah, that's by natural causes. But no one has said that Jesus was raised by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus from the dead, that Jesus was raised from a supernatural cause. And again, if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, that's a game changer. All bets are off. And it has nothing to do with what we observe with people dying and not returning to life by natural causes. What do you think, Doc?
I like it. I like it because one of the biggest objections to Hume is if you look at the laws of nature and what's allowed and not allowed, gravity and so on, it doesn't answer the question about what if somebody acts in nature from outside nature by a stronger power. It totally abrogates the Humean argument. You go, well, you got to know there is one like that. Well, I've already said there is an afterlife, and there's data, and there's a lot of data for God's existence. I just think the old I don't believe these things can't happen, doesn't stand up to empirical data.
Cool. Well, hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to conclude here. Let's see, is there anything? Okay. All right, one last, Adam G says, well, no, he's asking someone else that question. So we're going to wrap it up right here. Thank you so much for taking an hour and a half out of your time and joining us. Sorry for the technical difficulties, a couple of them that we had throughout. But thanks a lot for joining us. God bless you all. We'll have this posted where other people can view it very soon. So thank you. And we'll do this again another time. So thank you all.